The story that moved the world. Remember her? Grandmother lost custody of her granddaughter, and the court was shocked by what the girl said. This story reached 40 million people. What secrets did the girl reveal that left everyone stunned? Why was this loving grandmother deemed unfit to care for her only family? Who is the mysterious man seen near the scene of a tragic accident? And what dark truths are buried within a corporate empire's walls? As the battle for custody intensifies, how far will one woman go to protect the last piece of her shattered world? The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet as I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands trembling in my lap. Strength was something I had always prided myself on, especially after losing my son and daughter-in-law in that tragic accident. But today, a vulnerability crept in, one I hadn't felt in decades. The stakes were too high. Losing Scarlett would be losing the last piece of my family. Across the room, Scarlett sat, looking so small in the oversized chair. Her red hair was pulled back in a neat braid, but no amount of grooming could hide the fear in her eyes. My heart ached seeing her so brave yet so scared, forced to endure something no child her age should have to face. The judge, a stern figure with silver hair and a face lined with the weight of many such cases, cleared his throat. "Ms. Smith," he began, his voice resonating in the stillness of the room, "the court acknowledges your deep and loving relationship with your granddaughter, Scarlett. However, concerns have been raised about your ability to care for an 8-year-old child at your age." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I had known this would be their argument, but hearing it out loud made it feel more real. My age, an inevitable fact of life, was now being used against me, overshadowing the years of love and care I had given Scarlett. Daniel Hart, my lawyer, leaned toward me, his voice low and reassuring. "Stay strong, Mia. We're not done yet." I nodded, but the knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about proving that age didn't diminish my capacity to love, to nurture, to protect. Miss Carson, the social worker, rose next. Her severe expression and clipped tones had always put me on edge. "Your Honor," she began, "while we recognize Ms. Smith's affection for her granddaughter, we must prioritize Scarlett's long-term welfare. At 70, Ms. Smith may not be able to meet the demands, both physical and emotional, of raising a young child, especially one who has endured such trauma." Every fiber of my being wanted to protest, to scream that no one knew Scarlett better than I did. I was the one who had held her when she cried for her parents, who had read her stories until she fell asleep, who had promised her that everything would be okay. But I knew this wasn't the place for emotional outbursts. I had to remain composed. Daniel stood, his voice measured and calm. "Your Honor, while we do not deny that Scarlett has faced significant loss, we must also acknowledge the stability and love Ms. Smith has provided. Scarlett is not just a child in need of care. She is a child in need of consistency, of familiarity. Ms. Smith is the only family she has left, and to remove her from that care could exacerbate the trauma she has already experienced." The judge turned his gaze to Scarlett, his eyes softening. "Scarlett, sweetheart, is there anything you would like to say?" Scarlett hesitated, her eyes flicking toward me. I offered her a small nod, trying to infuse as much encouragement as I could into that simple gesture. She stood, her small hands gripping the edges of the chair for support. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, filled the room with a quiet strength. "I want to stay with Grandma. She's the only one who understands me. She makes me feel safe." Pride and sadness swelled in my chest. My brave little girl was fighting for our life together, just as I was. Ms. Carson was quick to respond. "Your Honor, while Scarlett's feelings are understandable, we must consider what is in her best interest long-term. She needs an environment where she can thrive, one that can meet her needs as she grows, an environment that might be better provided by younger caregivers." Daniel didn't miss a beat. "And what Scarlett needs most right now is stability. She's already lost so much: her parents, her home, her sense of security. Taking her away from her grandmother, the one constant in her life, would only deepen her trauma. The judge's expression remained unreadable as he listened to both sides. Finally, he turned to me. "Miss Smith, I'd like to hear from you directly. How do you feel about the concerns raised regarding your age and your ability to care for Scarlett?" I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Your Honor, I may be 70, but I am far from incapable. I raised my own children, and I have cared for Scarlett since the day she was born. Age is just a number. It doesn't measure love, devotion, or the ability to provide a safe, nurturing home. Scarlett is my world, and I would do anything to protect her, to keep her safe and happy." The judge nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on me a moment longer than I expected. "Thank you, Ms. Smith. We'll take a short recess before proceeding." As the judge left the courtroom, I finally allowed myself to breathe. Daniel squeezed my hand gently. "You did great, Mia. Whatever happens next, you've shown them how much you care." I nodded, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. I could only hope that the judge saw beyond my age, that he saw the love and commitment I had for Scarlett, because losing her now, after everything we had already lost, was something I didn't think I could bear. The courtroom was bathed in the soft glow of afternoon light when we reconvened after the recess. I had tried to maintain my composure during the break, but the weight of the situation pressed down on me like a ton of bricks. Scarlett was seated beside Daniel and me, her small hands twisting the hem of her dress anxiously. Something had changed in her eyes, something I hadn't noticed before. The judge returned to his seat, his expression grave. "We'll resume the proceedings now," he announced, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Scarlett, I understand you have something more to say." Scarlett looked up at me, her green eyes wide and anxious. I reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "It's okay, sweetheart. You can tell them," I whispered, hoping to give her the courage she needed. Scarlett nodded, then slowly stood up. Daniel guided her to the witness stand, where she could speak directly to the judge. "Scarlett, there's no need to be afraid," the judge said kindly. "You can tell us anything you think is important." Scarlett took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling as she tried to steady herself. I didn't tell anyone before because I was scared," she began, her voice trembling. "But I think I should tell you now." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, every eye on Scarlett. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and hope swirling inside me. What could she possibly have to say that was so important, so difficult? "My mom and dad," Scarlett continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were arguing the night before the accident." The room fell deathly silent. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to piece together where this revelation might lead. "What were they arguing about, Scarlett?" the judge asked gently. Scarlett swallowed hard, glancing at me for reassurance before continuing. "They were talking about someone who had threatened my dad. I didn't hear everything, but I heard my mom say that she was scared that something bad was going to happen." My breath caught in my throat. A threat? Why hadn't they told me? The judge's face darkened slightly as he leaned forward. "Scarlett, do you remember anything else? Anything at all?" Scarlett bit her lip, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think my dad said something about work. About someone trying to make him do something he didn't want to do. I don't know who it was, but it made them both really upset." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. This wasn't just a custody battle anymore. This was something far more serious. Daniel stood up, his voice calm and measured as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this new information warrants a deeper investigation. If Scarlett's parents were indeed threatened, it could change the entire context of their accident." The judge nodded slowly, clearly troubled by the revelation. "I agree, Mr. Hart. This is a serious matter that cannot be overlooked. I will order an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding the accident." Miss Carson, who had been watching the exchange with a tight-lipped expression, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, while this information is certainly troubling, I must remind the court that it does not change the immediate issue at hand, Scarlett's custody." Daniel turned to her, his eyes cold and determined. "On the contrary, Ms. Carson, this changes everything. If Scarlett's parents were indeed threatened, it could explain the emotional trauma she's been experiencing, and it reinforces the need for her to stay with someone who knows her, someone she trusts, like her grandmother." The judge held up a hand to silence them both. "Enough. I understand the gravity of this situation, and I will take everything into account. But for now, we must focus on what is best for Scarlett." Scarlett was escorted back to her seat beside me, her little face pale and drawn. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You were so brave, Scarlett," I whispered. "I'm so proud of you." "I'm sorry, Grandma," she whispered back, her voice quivering with emotion. "I didn't want to keep it a secret, but I was scared." "There's nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart," I reassured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You did the right thing. And now we're going to find out the truth." As the proceedings continued, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. Scarlett's revelation had changed the course of the trial, but it had also opened up a whole new set of terrifying questions. What had really happened the night of the accident? And more importantly, who was responsible? Daniel leaned over to me as the judge called for another recess. "Mia, this is big. If we can prove there was foul play involved, it could turn everything around. But what does that mean for Scarlett?" I asked, my voice low and anxious. "It means we have to dig deeper," Daniel replied, his eyes hard with resolve. "We have to find out who threatened her parents, and why." As we left the courtroom, I felt a new sense of determination. This wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about justice for my son and daughter-in-law, and about protecting Scarlett from whatever dark forces were at play. No matter what it took, I was going to get to the bottom of this, and make sure Scarlett was safe. The days following Scarlett's revelation in court were a whirlwind. My mind raced with questions, and sleep eluded me as I mulled over every possible scenario. Daniel and I had our work cut out for us. If there was any chance that the accident that claimed my son and daughter-in-law's lives was more than just a tragic misfortune, we needed to uncover the truth, and fast. We began our investigation by diving into the details of the accident. Daniel spent hours poring over the police reports, while I scored through my son's old emails and documents, looking for anything that might offer a clue. The more we dug, the more convinced we became that something wasn't right. One morning, as we sat in Daniel's office, he suddenly leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Mia, there's something here that doesn't add up," he said, his voice heavy with concern. I looked up from the stack of papers in front of me, feeling the weight of his words. "What is it?" Daniel picked up a particular document and handed it to me. "This is the report from the mechanic who inspected the car after the accident. There's mention of a brake failure, something that should have been caught during the last maintenance check. But here's the thing. Your son's car had just been serviced 2 weeks before the accident. There's no way the brakes should have failed like that." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the report. "Are you saying someone tampered with the car?" Daniel nodded grimly. "It's starting to look that way. We need to find out who serviced the car last, and if there were any irregularities in the records." I felt a surge of anger and fear all at once. If someone had tampered with the car, it meant that my son and daughter-in-law's deaths weren't an accident. They were murdered. And if that was true, then Scarlett and I were potentially in danger as well. "I'll talk to the mechanic," Daniel continued, breaking through my thoughts. "In the meantime, Mia, I need you to think back. Did your son mention anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the accident? Anyone new in his life? Any unusual behavior?" I racked my brain, trying to recall every conversation I'd had with my son in the weeks before his death. He was stressed. I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. He mentioned that work was getting intense, but he didn't go into detail. I just assumed it was the usual corporate pressure. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Corporate pressure can be a dangerous thing, especially if it involves the wrong people. Did he mention any names? I shook my head, frustration bubbling up inside me. No, he didn't. But now that you mention it, there was one thing. He seemed unusually protective of Scarlett in those last few weeks, almost like he was worried something might happen to her. Daniel's expression grew even more serious. If your son was involved in something dangerous, it's possible he was trying to shield Scarlett from it. Whatever it was, we need to find out. As we continued our investigation, Daniel's contacts in law enforcement and his private network proved invaluable. One lead led to another, and soon we were tracing a line from my son's work back to a company he had been consulting for, a company with a shady reputation. After days of digging, we finally got a breakthrough. Daniel received a tip from a trusted source who had worked with the same company. "Mia," he said, his voice tinged with urgency, "we need to talk." We met at a small cafe downtown, away from prying eyes. Daniel arrived looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "What is it, Daniel?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "I just got word that the company your son was consulting for, Emerald Tech, has been under investigation for illegal activities, including money laundering and corporate espionage. They've got ties to some very dangerous people." My stomach turned. "And you think my son got caught up in this?" Daniel nodded. "It's possible. If he found out something he wasn't supposed to, or if he refused to play along, it could have put him, and his family, in danger." The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was terrifying. "Do you think that's why they were killed?" "It's looking more and more likely," Daniel replied. "But we need proof. Something solid that we can take to the authorities. We've got to be careful, Mia. These people won't hesitate to cover their tracks, and that means they could come after you or Scarlett next." The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I refused to let fear paralyze me. "What do we do next?" "We need to get our hands on any documents or correspondence your son had with Emerald Tech. If we can find evidence that he was involved in something they wanted to keep quiet, we'll have the leverage we need." Over the next few days, Daniel and I worked tirelessly, piecing together the clues that had been scattered across my son's life. Late one night, as I was going through yet another box of his belongings, I found something that made my blood run cold. A flash drive hidden in the lining of one of his old briefcases. "Daniel," I called, my voice shaking. "I think I found something." He rushed over, and together we plugged the flash drive into his laptop. What we found confirmed our worst fears: emails, documents, and files that detailed a massive cover-up by Emerald Tech. My son had discovered their illegal activities and was trying to gather evidence to expose them. Daniel looked at me, his face pale. "This is it, Mia. This is the proof we need." But as relief started to wash over me, it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of dread. "If we have this, they'll come after us, won't they?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Not if we're smart about it. We need to take this to the authorities, but we also need to ensure that Scarlett is safe. You can't go back to the house, Mia. Not until we know it's secure." I nodded, my mind racing. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe." As we left the cafe, I knew that our lives were about to change in ways I could never have imagined. We were no longer just fighting for custody. Now we were fighting for our lives. But I would not back down. I would uncover the truth, no matter what it cost me. And I would protect Scarlett with every ounce of strength I had left. The day they took Scarlett away from me was one of the darkest in my life. Even now, as I sit here reflecting on it, the memory brings a fresh wave of pain. Miss Thompson, the social worker assigned to our case, had tried to reassure me, explaining that Scarlett would be placed in a safe and temporary environment, while the investigation was ongoing. But nothing she said could dull the agony of watching my granddaughter, my precious Scarlett, being taken away. Weeks passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Every day, I called the agency, pleading for updates, praying for the day I could bring her back home. But each time, I was met with the same vague responses. "We're doing everything we can, Mrs. Smith," or "the process takes time." The uncertainty gnawed at me, making the wait unbearable. Our visits were strictly limited and supervised by social workers who hovered over us like hawks, their presence a constant reminder that Scarlett was no longer fully mine. Those visits, brief and strained, left both of us feeling more isolated than before. Scarlett, once a bright and lively child, now seemed withdrawn and scared. The spark in her eyes, the light that had always shone so brightly, was dimming with each passing day. One afternoon, after another frustrating phone call with the agency, I met with Daniel at a small diner near his office. We sat in a corner booth, the weight of our conversation pressing down on me as I stared into my untouched coffee. "Mia, I've been looking into the foster family," Daniel began, breaking the silence. "From what I can gather, they're decent people, but that doesn't mean Scarlett's not struggling." I sighed deeply, running a hand through my thinning hair. "She's just a child, Daniel. She needs stability, not to be passed around like she's a problem no one wants to deal with." Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and we're doing everything we can to expedite the process. But until we have the evidence we need, our hands are tied. The courts won't return custody until they're convinced it's safe." "I'm her grandmother," I snapped, frustration bubbling over. "How can they think she's safer with strangers than with me?" Daniel reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on mine. "Mia, I know this is hard, but you need to stay strong. For Scarlett. We'll get her back, I promise. But we need to be careful. We can't risk tipping off the wrong people before we're ready." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Miss Thompson. "Scarlett's having trouble adjusting. Please be prepared for a difficult visit tomorrow." My heart sank. "She's not doing well, Daniel. She's not herself." Daniel's brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean?" "She's been acting out," I explained, my voice trembling. "During our last visit, she wouldn't let go of me. She kept asking when she could come home, and when I couldn't give her a clear answer, she started crying. It took everything in me not to break down right there." Daniel's eyes softened with empathy. "This isn't easy for either of you, Mia. But Scarlett needs to know that you're fighting for her. That's what will keep her going." The next day, I arrived at the visitation center, my heart heavy with dread. Scarlett was already there, sitting on a small couch with her arms wrapped around her knees. Her once vibrant red hair was now dull, and her eyes looked tired, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her tiny shoulders. "Scarlett, my love," I called gently, hoping to bring a smile to her face. She looked up at me, her lips curling into a weak smile. "Hi, Grandma." I pulled her into a tight hug, feeling how fragile she had become. "How are you, sweetheart?" Scarlett shrugged, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like it here." I held her close, trying to soothe her fears. "I know, darling. But this is only temporary. You'll be back home with me soon, I promise." She looked up at me with tears brimming in her eyes. "Why can't I come home now? Did I do something wrong?" The question shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. I cupped her face in my hands, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, Scarlett, you've done nothing wrong. This isn't your fault, sweetheart. The grown-ups just need some time to sort things out. But I'm working very hard to bring you back home." Scarlett sniffled, clinging to me like a lifeline. "I miss you, Grandma. I don't like the people here. They're nice, but they're not you." My throat tightened, and I had to blink back tears. "I miss you too, my little angel. And I'm doing everything I can to get you home. You just have to be brave for a little while longer." The rest of the visit was spent with Scarlett on my lap, her small fingers tracing circles on my arm as I read her a story. But even as I read, I could see how much she was struggling. Her eyes were distant, her mind elsewhere. She was a child lost in a world she didn't understand, and there was little I could do to ease her pain. As the visit came to an end, the social worker approached us, indicating it was time to go. Scarlett clung to me, refusing to let go. "Please, Grandma, don't make me go back." My heart shattered, but I had to stay strong. "I'll see you soon, Scarlett. Remember what I told you. Be brave, okay?" She nodded reluctantly, her grip loosening. "I'll try." As they led her away, I felt like a piece of my soul was being torn out. I watched her go, knowing that I had to keep fighting, no matter what it took. For Scarlett's sake, I had to be strong. But the pain of seeing her suffer was almost too much to bear. When I met Daniel later that evening, the weight of the day's visit hung heavy between us. He could see it in my eyes before I even said a word. "She's not doing well, Daniel. I'm scared for her." Daniel nodded, his expression grim. "We'll do whatever it takes, Mia. But we need to be strategic about this. The evidence we found is strong, but we need to make sure it's airtight before we present it to the court." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I just want her back, Daniel. I don't care what it takes." "And you will get her back," he assured me, his voice firm. "But we need to be patient. These people are dangerous, and we can't afford to make a mistake." I nodded, knowing he was right, but the ache in my heart wouldn't ease. Scarlett was my world, and I would do anything to protect her. The nightmare of foster care was just another hurdle in our path, but I was determined to overcome it. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I made a silent vow. No matter what, I would bring Scarlett home. And I would make sure that those responsible for her parents' deaths would pay for what they had done. I would not rest until justice was served, and until Scarlett was safe in my arms again. Weeks had passed since Scarlett was placed in foster care, and the weight of each passing day bore down on me. Every night was a restless one, my mind churning with thoughts of Scarlett and the unresolved questions surrounding her parents' deaths. The momentum of the case was shifting, but it was like trying to grasp smoke, elusive and intangible. Daniel had been working tirelessly, combing through every piece of information we could find. We had a few leads, but nothing substantial enough to sway the court. I knew the clock was ticking. The longer Scarlett remained in foster care, the more it broke her spirit, and mine. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring into my cold cup of coffee, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to answer it. "Hello," I answered, trying to keep the hope out of my voice. "Mia, it's Daniel. You need to get down to my office right away. I think we found something." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Daniel? What have you found?" "I'd rather explain in person. Just get here as soon as you can." I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my coat and purse, rushing out the door and driving to Daniel's office, my mind racing with possibilities. What could he have found? Was it the break we needed? When I arrived, Daniel was waiting for me in the conference room, his expression serious but with a spark of urgency in his eyes. "Mia," he said as I entered, gesturing for me to sit down. "We may have just uncovered a significant piece of evidence." I sat down across from him, my heart pounding. "What is it? Please tell me." Daniel handed me a folder, and as I opened it, I saw a series of documents, emails, financial records, and a few photographs. "We've been digging into Scarlett's father's work, and it seems he was involved in something much larger than we initially thought." I looked up at Daniel, my brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. Scarlett's father, Robert, was working on a high-profile case involving a major corporation. He was set to testify against them in court, and it appears that he was receiving threats in the weeks leading up to the accident. My breath caught in my throat. "Are you saying that they might have had something to do with the crash?" "It's possible," Daniel said cautiously. These emails suggest that Robert was pressured to drop the case. When he refused, the threats escalated. I felt a chill run down my spine. But how do we prove it? How do we connect these threats to the accident? That's the tricky part, Daniel admitted. We have circumstantial evidence, but we need something concrete. However, there's more. He pulled out a photograph from the folder and handed it to me. It was a grainy image of a man standing near a car. Robert's car. This was taken by a traffic camera a few miles from the site of the crash. We believe this man was following Robert and his wife that night. I stared at the photo, my mind reeling. Who is he? We're still trying to identify him, but we're closer than ever, Daniel said. We also found that a large sum of money was transferred to an offshore account under the name of one of the key executives from the corporation Robert was investigating. The transfer was made just days before the accident. I shook my head, trying to process everything. This is huge, Daniel. But how do we present this to the court? How do we make them see the connection? Daniel looked at me, his eyes determined. We need to be strategic. We'll request a subpoena for the corporation's records and bring in an expert to analyze the crash data. We'll also petition the court for more time to investigate, based on this new evidence. I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of hope. And what about Scarlett? How does this help her? If we can prove that her parents were targeted, it could change everything, Daniel explained. The court might see that Scarlett's placement in foster care was a result of an incomplete understanding of the situation. We could use this to push for her immediate return to your custody. My eyes welled with tears of relief. You really think we can do this? Daniel reached across the table, his voice filled with conviction. Mia, I'm more confident than ever. But we need to move quickly. We can't let them cover their tracks. As Daniel and I discussed the next steps, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger at the people responsible for tearing my family apart. Fear of what we might uncover, but most of all, determination to see this through. I had to stay strong, for Scarlett's sake. A few days later, we found ourselves in court again. This time, the atmosphere was different. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, had granted our request to present the new evidence. As Daniel laid out the details, the threats Robert received, the suspicious money transfer, and the photograph of the unknown man, there was a palpable tension in the room. The opposing lawyer tried to downplay the significance of the evidence, but I could see that the judge was paying close attention. Finally, Daniel called me to the stand. As I took my place, I felt a surge of determination. This was my chance to fight for Scarlett, to show the court that she belonged with me. Mia, Daniel began, his voice calm and reassuring. Can you tell the court how Scarlett has been affected since the loss of her parents? I took a deep breath. Scarlett is a bright, loving child, but she's been through so much. Losing her parents in such a tragic way. It's taken a toll on her. She's been anxious, withdrawn, and she's struggled to understand why this happened. She needs stability, a safe and loving home. And I'm the only family she has left. And how has she been coping since being placed in foster care? Daniel asked. I felt a lump in my throat as I answered. She's not the same. She's scared, confused. She misses her home, her routine. She asks me every time I see her when she can come back home, and I don't have the answers she needs. Daniel nodded, his eyes full of empathy. And what would it mean for Scarlett to come back home to you? Tears welled up in my eyes. It would mean everything. She needs to know she's not alone, that she's loved and cared for. I've been fighting for her, and I'll continue to fight until she's home where she belongs. The judge looked at me with a thoughtful expression before turning to the opposing lawyer. Do you have any questions for the witness? The opposing lawyer stood, his face unreadable. No, Your Honor. No questions. As I stepped down from the stand, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had presented our case, and now it was in the hands of the judge. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't giving up. Not until Scarlett was home, and justice was served for my son and daughter-in-law. As we left the courtroom, Daniel turned to me, his voice steady. "We're getting closer, Mia. The judge is taking this seriously. We need to stay strong." I nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I won't rest until Scarlett is safe. And with that, we walked out of the courthouse together, ready to face whatever came next. The battle wasn't over, but we had just taken a significant step forward. The truth was emerging, and with it, the hope that Scarlett would finally be able to come back home. The days following our courtroom breakthrough were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel and I were relentless, digging deeper into the tangled web that seemed to surround Scarlett's parents' deaths. The more we uncovered, the more it became clear that we were dealing with something far more sinister than we had ever imagined. I could hardly sleep, my mind buzzing with thoughts of what we might find next. The image of that unidentified man near Robert's car haunted me, and the financial records hinted at something far-reaching and dangerous. It was no longer just about Scarlett's custody. It was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. One afternoon, I was sitting in Daniel's office, surrounded by piles of documents. Daniel was on the phone, trying to reach a contact who might help us identify the man in the photograph. I was scanning through Robert's emails again, looking for anything we might have missed. As Daniel hung up the phone, he looked at me with a mixture of excitement and caution. "Mia, I think we're about to get the break we've been waiting for." My contact was able to dig up some information on the man in the photograph. I looked up, my heart pounding. "Who is he?" "His name is Victor Alvarez," Daniel said, handing me a file. "He's a known fixer, a man who specializes in making problems disappear for powerful clients. He's been linked to several high-profile cases where witnesses or key players met with mysterious accidents before they could testify." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I flipped through the file. There were photos of Victor, reports of his involvement in various incidents, and a list of his known associates. So he was hired to take out Robert and his wife, because of the case Robert was working on. Daniel nodded grimly. "That's what it looks like. Robert's refusal to back down made him a target, and it seems the people he was up against were willing to do whatever it took to silence him." I clenched my fists, anger bubbling up inside me. "We have to expose this, Daniel. They can't get away with it." "We will," Daniel assured me, "but we need to be smart about it. We have enough to raise serious questions, but we need concrete proof if we want to bring them down." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Where do we even start? Daniel tapped the file. "Victor Alvarez is our key. If we can track him down and get him to talk, or if we can link him directly to the crash, we might be able to blow this wide open." As we continued to strategize, Daniel's phone rang again. He answered, his expression shifting as he listened. "You're sure? That's incredible. Thank you for letting us know." He hung up and turned to me, his eyes shining with urgency. "That was our investigator. They found a witness, someone who saw Victor Alvarez near the crash site on the night of the accident." My heart leaped. "A witness? Who is it?" "An older gentleman who lives near the road where the crash happened," Daniel explained. "He's been hesitant to come forward because he's afraid of retaliation, but he's willing to talk if we can guarantee his safety." I didn't hesitate. "We need to meet him, Daniel. We have to hear what he knows." Later that evening, Daniel and I drove out to meet the witness, a man named Mr. Jenkins. His house was small and isolated, tucked away in a quiet corner of the countryside. When we arrived, he was waiting for us on the porch, his weathered face lined with worry. "Mr. Jenkins." Daniel greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. We know this isn't easy." Mr. Jenkins nodded, glancing nervously around. "I'm only doing this because it's the right thing to do. But I don't want any trouble, you understand." "You won't have any trouble from us," I assured him, trying to ease his fears. We just want to know what you saw. Mr. Jenkins led us inside, where we sat around a small table. He poured us cups of strong black coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. That night, I was out on my porch. I sometimes have trouble sleeping, so I come out here to get some air. That's when I saw the car. Robert's car. I guess it was, driving down the road. But there was another car following close behind. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. Can you describe the second car? It was a dark sit-in, Mr. Jenkins recalled. I couldn't see much because it was late, but the way it was driving, it didn't feel right, like it was trying to force the other car off the road. A few minutes later, I heard the crash. I felt a knot in my stomach. Did you see the driver of the second car? Mr. Jenkins nodded slowly. After the crash, I saw a man get out of the sit-in and walk over to the wreck. He didn't look like someone who was trying to help. He just stood there for a few minutes, then got back in his car and drove off. Could you identify him if you saw him again? Daniel asked. Mr. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. I think so. I got a good look at him when he was standing by the wreckage. Daniel pulled out the photograph of Victor Alvarez and slid it across the table. Is this the man you saw? Mr. Jenkins stared at the photograph, his eyes narrowing. That's him. That's the man I saw. I exchanged a glance with Daniel, feeling a surge of hope. Mr. Jenkins, your testimony could be crucial in bringing the truth to light. We'll do everything we can to protect you. Mr. Jenkins nodded, his expression resolute. I'll do it. I'll tell the court what I saw. The following days were a blur of preparation. Daniel filed motions to introduce Mr. Jenkins' testimony and to subpoena additional records from the corporation Robert had been investigating. We knew we were close, but the stakes were higher than ever. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Daniel presented our new evidence, laying out the connections between Victor Alvarez, the corporation, and the crash. When Mr. Jenkins took the stand, the room fell silent. He described in detail what he had seen that night, pointing directly to Victor Alvarez as the man who had been at the crash site. The opposing lawyer tried to discredit him, but Mr. Jenkins stood firm, his voice unwavering. As Daniel wrapped up our case, I watched the judge closely, trying to read his reaction. He listened intently, his expression unreadable, before finally adjourning the court for the day. As we left the courtroom, Daniel turned to me, his voice filled with cautious optimism. We did everything we could, Mia. Now it's in the judge's hands. I nodded, feeling both exhausted and hopeful. I just want Scarlett to be safe, and I want justice for my son and daughter-in-law. Daniel put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. We're close, Mia. We're very close. As we walked out into the cool evening air, I looked up at the sky, silently praying for the truth to finally come to light. The conspiracy that had taken my family from me was unraveling, and I was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what it took. The days leading up to the final court hearing felt like an eternity. Every hour was filled with a mix of hope, anxiety, and fear. Scarlett's safety, the memory of my son and daughter-in-law, and our fight for justice all hinged on what the judge would decide. Daniel and I had done everything we could, and now it was out of our hands. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress. It felt like the right choice, a quiet tribute to my lost family. As I stared at my reflection, I took a deep breath, trying to steady the nerves that churned in my stomach. I couldn't afford to break down, not now. Scarlett needed me to be strong. When I arrived at the courthouse, Daniel was already there, waiting outside. He greeted me with a reassuring smile, though I could see the tension in his eyes. Mia, he said, taking my hand in his. No matter what happens today, I want you to know that we fought the good fight. We've uncovered the truth, and that's something they can't take away. I nodded, my voice catching in my throat. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. He squeezed my hand gently. "Let's go in and see this through." The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers. The air buzzed with anticipation. I saw Scarlett's foster parents sitting near the front, their expressions unreadable. Scarlett herself was sitting between them, her small face pale and drawn, but when she saw me, she gave a faint smile that warmed my heart. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. As we took our seats again, I noticed how solemn the judge looked, as if the weight of the case had settled heavily on his shoulders. "We're here today to deliver the final verdict in the matter of the custody of Scarlett Smith and to address the findings related to the death of her parents, Robert and Linda Smith," the judge began, his voice deep and steady. I held my breath as he recapped the evidence presented over the past few weeks, the witness testimonies, the financial records, and most damningly, the involvement of Victor Alvarez. He spoke of the conspiracy that had been uncovered, the attempts to silence Robert through fatal means, and the impact it had on Scarlett. When he finally looked up from his papers, his gaze swept across the courtroom, landing briefly on me before moving to Scarlett. "In light of the new evidence presented, it's clear that the deaths of Robert and Linda Smith were not accidents, but premeditated acts of violence intended to prevent Mr. Smith from exposing illegal activities. This court cannot ignore the gravity of these findings." My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath, waiting for the judge's next words. "As for the custody of Scarlett Smith," he continued, his voice softening, "this has been a matter of great concern. While the state initially deemed Mrs. Mia Smith unfit due to her age, the court must also consider the best interests of the child." He paused, and in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the tension in every muscle of my body. The court has reviewed the testimony, including Scarlett Smith's own statements, and the evidence that Mrs. Smith has been a loving, devoted grandmother who has fought tirelessly for her granddaughter's well-being. Taking into account the trauma that Scarlett has endured and the need for stability and care, this court finds that it is in Scarlett's best interest to be placed in the custody of her grandmother, Mia Smith. A collective gasp swept through the room. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked over at Scarlett. She was staring at me, wide-eyed, before a huge smile broke across her face. Daniel turned to me, his eyes shining with emotion. "We did it, Mia." But the judge wasn't finished. He cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "However, given Mrs. Smith's age and the potential challenges that may arise, the court orders that regular check-ins be conducted by social services to ensure that Scarlett's needs are being met." I nodded, barely able to speak, but grateful for this compromise. It was a small price to pay for having Scarlett back. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court has decided to reopen the investigation into the deaths of Robert and Linda Smith, with the new evidence to be passed on to the relevant authorities for further action. Those responsible for these heinous acts will be brought to justice. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the session, the courtroom erupted into murmurs and whispers. Reporters scrambled to their feet, and I saw Scarlett's foster parents whispering to each other, their expressions a mix of relief and resignation. Scarlett's foster mother led her toward me. When Scarlett reached me, she flung her arms around my waist, holding on tightly. I knelt down, wrapping her in my arms, feeling the overwhelming sense of relief and joy wash over me. "Mia, I knew you'd win," Scarlett whispered into my ear. I pulled back slightly to look at her, wiping away the tears that streaked her cheeks. "You were so brave, Scarlett. I'm so proud of you." Daniel approached us, his voice soft. "Mia, Scarlett, we should get out of here. There will be a lot of questions, and I think you both deserve some peace." I nodded, taking Scarlett's hand. "Let's go home," I said, feeling the word home fill with new meaning. As we walked out of the courthouse together, the sun was shining brightly, as if the world itself was celebrating our victory. The reporters called out, cameras flashing, but I ignored them. My focus was on Scarlett, on her future, on the life we would build together. Daniel walked beside us, a steady presence. Mia, this isn't the end. We still have a long road ahead with the investigation. I know, I replied, glancing down at Scarlett, who was skipping beside me, her hand firmly in mine. But we'll face it together. I'm not afraid anymore. And I wasn't. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were going to be okay. The truth had come to light, and justice was on the horizon. We were going home, and that was all that mattered.